I wanted to start with you and ask you to talk a little bit about the news from your company, since there's been some big news, and tell us both what you've been announcing over the last week and also how it fits into the broader landscape of knowledge in this field.
Thanks. First of all, I want to thank David for organizing this amazing conference, and also really grateful for inviting us here. I saw the previous panel was really incredible, and in fact, I want to start by connecting the dots after we heard how incredibly challenging is the political challenge. We believe that our role, this is the reason we started Stardust, is to build safe, actionable options for governments for the case at some point they will decide to move forward with this technology. By the way, Michael, we will not deploy this technology. We are developing an option for governments. And I think when we started Stardust, we realized that the option that was on the table, which was essentially sulfate-based, which on one hand we know that is capable of performing this effect of cooling the planet, comes with a long list of side effects. Obviously, everyone knows that this is toxic, but sometimes people overlook the fact that, I would say, in spite of many years of research and also the evidence we get from peanut turbo, the uncertainties, as was mentioned earlier, are still very large. And unfortunately, sulfates are not suitable for testing at scale, which does not bear, I'd say, taking significant risks on climatic impact. So we started from the point of asking ourselves, can we build, I would say, a better, safer option? And to your question, David, what we just did is that for the first time, and really proud of the work that our science and engineering team have been conducted, released a series of papers which actually builds, I would say, an end-to-end basis for what we believe would be a safe, actionable option for sunlight reflection method, essentially building on a particle which is safe, putting the evidence for the dispersion system, demonstrating how we can monitor this technology, how we can tag these particles, how we will be able to manufacture these particles. And though there is still a lot of work to be done, and also we expect a lot of scrutiny from the scientific community, and this is part of the reason why we released these papers, we feel that this is a major step forward in putting on the table what we expect in the end will be a safe, actionable option.
And just to pull back a little bit from the particular research and the particular path that you're following, I mean, we're up here today talking about private and nonprofit approaches. Why is it important? Why is it more valuable? Why does it appeal to you and your team to be pursuing this work in a private environment as opposed to a pure research academic environment or a nonprofit?
Yes. First of all, I'll start by saying that, as I would say, any groundbreaking technology, or definitely most of them, it started with academic research. This is the way that it has been for any topic. And also the natural choice was to look for sulfates, essentially mimicking the natural phenomenon. We believe that as the field evolved, and I would say as the climate crisis escalates, the next natural step is to move to do actual work of building options. And building options have been always, when you look at medicine, when you look at space, when you look at genome sequencing, something that private companies did. Essentially, we believe that working and joining forces with the academic community, with nonprofits and with government, because in the end of the day, this is an all-age effort, the role of private companies is actually, I would say, to challenge what has been so far the basis for the solution, and try to provide options which are actually better. So the short answer is building technologies has always been something that private companies did, and we believe that this is the case also here.
So Dakota, you have a different background and a different approach. Tell us how you see the value of a nonprofit structure for research in this area and why that seems so important to you and everyone at your team.
Sure. So Reflective's view is that the first job is not to pick the winning particle or the winning aerosol. It's to build the foundations for decisions that governments and publics can trust. And that requires an agnosticism to what that particle or potential pathway is. And so the way that we think about it at Reflective is we are trying to, get to the point where there can be well-considered, thoroughly evaluated evidence for multiple different options. And so this is not to suggest that, sort of engineered particles may not play a role ever. I think they merit study. But I think what we lack at the moment is the institutional architecture that's required for claims made by, any one organization to really be trusted. And I want to quickly just touch on, some of the points that Yanai made around sulfates, which is, I think you start with sort of the premise that, that there is something better than sulfate and that sulfates are not good enough. And I would say I completely agree on the first of those. I think it's very unlikely that volcanoes happen to spew the exact right material into the stratosphere when they erupt. But I do think sulfates are what we understand well. There are, we have evidence from millennia of, and we've certainly observational evidence from decades of volcanic eruptions that allow us to understand what happens after a volcanic eruption, what happens when you introduce sulfates into the stratosphere. We lack that for novel engineered particles. And so our sense is that, it isn't rather than, first, it is not a decision a priori that there is one right answer. We need to be evaluating sulfates. We need to be evaluating other potential forms of intervention. But that, we should be evaluating both of them on the merits rather than simply dismissing one outright.
So there's a scientific question about exactly, what is the optimal path forward. There's also a political question about what is a workable path forward. And that, to me, gets to something that you were just emphasizing, Dakota, which is this question of trust. Now, we could sit up here and sort of debate the merits of engineered particles versus natural sulfates, but I'm curious to hear you both talk about this question, how we should pursue this research, how we should present it to the public in the context of the trust environment that we find ourselves in already. So, you were talking earlier about this sort of traditional path of development from pure research in an academic setting to, sort of contrarian application by entrepreneurs. And Dakota, you were talking about the importance of having some trusted authority weighing in on whether this research is valuable and safe and all the rest of it. And I wonder, in both cases, actually, how much those mental models still apply. I mean, Dakota, you came to this research from Gavi, and thinking about the way that public skepticism has grown about vaccination, public health, seems to me to throw a lot of complications on the idea that nonprofits will be inevitably trusted in the space. And I would just point at the way that the public is reacting to the rollout of AI in this company, which is tied up in suspicion of corporate power and concentration of private interests. And just on both fronts, I just see us living in a quite different world when it comes to trust. And I wonder how you each think about those changes, how you want to navigate that landscape, and whether you think or how you think we might best meet a increasingly distrustful public where they are to talk about some things that intuitively, like in the average American's brain when they're going to sleep at night, seems quite large and scary, the prospect of, perturbing the planet's atmosphere. Maybe Dakota, you want to answer first?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually harken back to a comment that Hina made on the previous panel, which is, I think that what you're voicing here perhaps is a pretty American-centric perspective. We live in a time of less trust, but I don't think universally we live in a time that is as distrustful as what we're seeing in the U.S. at the moment. When I was at Gavi, one of the things that we talked about, and for those who don't know Gavi, it's a public-private partnership that vaccinates about 60% of the world's kids in a given year. We didn't see much, this was, 2015, 2014, we didn't see significant vaccine hesitancy at the time, in part because people were directly seeing the benefits of vaccination. It's one thing if you're sitting in Marin County and nobody's had measles in decades, to sort of question whether or not you should vaccinate your child against measles. This is a very different thing if you're in a country where you have directly seen what happens in children who haven't been vaccinated and can say, there's real benefit. And so I think, in a lot of the conversation around climate, similarly, it's one thing if you're sort of living in an air-conditioned bubble, and it's quite different if you're experiencing, significant climate harms. So I think that we are... we're in this position where, yes, there's questions around trust, there's questions of who to trust, and that requires this research to be done in ways that is as sort of above board as possible. And so with that, I think, one of the things that we see as really important from our seat at Reflective is that we're completely agnostic to whether or not SAI ultimately proves to be a good idea. We want to get to the point of informed decisions. And if that decision is ultimately this shouldn't move forward, we count that as a win. That objectivity, I think, is really critical for publics, for funders, for policy organizations to say this actually feels like there's sort of clear intent and objectivity. And I think one of the challenges, it's not that there's anything fundamentally wrong with, for-profit companies, but when you have investors who are saying, what we've bet upon is that this will be deployed, it makes it hard to have that same level of objectivity. And so, particularly in the absence at the moment of, Yanai, you've used the analogy of saying that Stardust is almost akin to like a drug development company preparing to apply to the FDA for approval. And the problem is there is no FDA in this space. And so, we lack an independent assessment capability that would provide that trust. And where that leaves us is, a sense that the organizations who are furthering this research have a stake in the game and can't be objective about what they're presenting.
I'll ask you a similar question in a second, but Dakota, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I wonder what you make of the sort of, in this context, the sort of narrative of OpenAI, which was founded as a nonprofit, turned into a quasi-profit, and is now being run, to most American eyes at least, like one of the most ruthless profit-seeking companies on the planet. So, most companies don't evolve that way. Most nonprofits don't evolve that way. But I wonder how you think about that evolution and whether it changes any of this calculus.
I mean, I think it speaks to, the AI safety conversation has been playing catch up from the beginning. And because there was the opportunity to make huge profit, there was that incentive to make the corporate switch. And so, I think one of the challenges in this space is, at the moment there, at least for us, we don't say there's any profit motive to be made. And so there's no incentive for us to make that switch. And we're really happy in that place. And I think once you start introducing profit motive into it, it starts to pervert the incentives really quickly.
How would you respond to that?
No, I'll start by completely agreeing with what you're saying, that there would never, in our view, be a deployment without having the analogous to an FDA, right? No one should trust any private company like you wouldn't trust on medicine or vaccine. This is what you worked earlier. You shouldn't trust on our statement that this is safe, that this is controllable. Right? Then the question is, what is the right sequencing? Because when you look at history, and I think David mentioned it in his preliminary remarks when he was speaking about practical governance coming with action on the field, it always started, also FDA started after people started developing vaccines and medicines, and the same goes for genome sequencing, for space. Essentially, governance and institutions follow the advancement in this field. And I think that the work that both of us are doing, essentially constraining the uncertainties, trying to reduce the risks, is what should, and I think we're both pushing for governance and for regulatory framework. I don't think that regulators don't regulate ideas and concepts. They regulate things that are happening in the right world. So yes, I completely agree with you. I think that the work that we're doing, and if I may say in a different setting you're doing, is pushing these boundaries and calling for these regulators to move forward. And, I want to refer for a second for the example you've mentioned of Gavi, which is definitely doing an amazing work, making sure that, the most vulnerable communities, the poorest communities will get these vaccines, right? And in parallel, you have private companies which are developing these vaccines, and you have FDA, which is regulating. So in the end of the day, the way we see it is that this is an all-ends effort. It's not one or the other, right? In the end of the day, you need companies to develop vaccine. We believe you need companies to develop safe, actionable options for SRM, and at the same time, you need non-for-profits, and you need academia, and you need governments.
Well, and I think that raises an important point, which is, a conversation like this can collapse the discussion into is it going to be a nonprofit moving stuff forward, or is it going to be a for-profit moving stuff forward? And either one of those, first, it's a false binary, but it also, it assumes that there's a single protagonist. And that's not the case, right? There is an entire field, an entire ecosystem that is pretty nascent at this point, and multiple different institutions that essentially are missing.
But if we're imagining in the near future some amount of regulatory structure, what are you imagining? Because I'm looking out at the world and I'm like, I don't know what I can even envision happening at the state level, at the national level, at the international level. It doesn't seem intuitive to me. If I rewound 10 years and we were having this conversation in this sort of Paris Agreement moment, I could tell myself a story about global governance coming together around issues like this, along with many others. And that was probably always a naive story, but it was still a story that had purchase for a lot of people in positions of power all around the world. And I wonder whether we've lost that, to what extent we've lost that, and given where we are now, what kinds of actual oversight and regulatory function we should be hoping for, we should be expecting. You were just talking about the need for that. Where does it come from, and what does it look like?
Yeah, so maybe it's worth alluding to the previous panel, describing how difficult it will be to make political decisions regarding outdoor experiments, right? Because currently, and again, I'm going back to the reference case of sulfates, it's really binary. It's either nothing, or you need to go all the way up to testing at scale, which will have climatic impacts, which is an incredibly difficult decision. The reason for this is that the background of sulfates at the atmosphere is so high, it's essentially a few hundred thousands of tons of sulfates, and to do meaningful experiments, you need to go over this threshold, which is an incredibly difficult decision. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, can you come up with a system which is more like a staircase, which will still be a very difficult political decision, but one that you can start thinking in a more rational manner, saying you want to start very low, well, orders of magnitude below any climatic impact or environmental impact, to test your models, to make sure that you know how these particles move around. For this, you need, for example, a tagged particle. This is part of the technology we're building. Then you have a very clear set of success criteria. Only if you meet them, you move forward. Again, this is not to say that this solves the problem. Still, it will be a very difficult political and societal challenge. But we firmly believe that we as a scientific community, and this is not a single company's effort, this is a larger effort of the scientific community, is to develop, I would say, the best option which could be suitable for then policymakers to seriously consider it. And this means, in our view, a safe particle, ability to do this gradual testing, and ability to do monitoring and control, which currently lack for the reference case of sulfates.
Dakota, it looked like you had some quibbles with that answer.
Yeah, so I was shaking my head there because I and the research community that we work with, I think fundamentally disagree with the idea that you can't test sulfates in order to resolve very important uncertainties at scales much, much smaller, orders of magnitude smaller than what would cause any climactic effect. I'll come back to that in a second, but I think a place we do agree is on this model of stage-gated research. The previous panel was speaking about the idea of a sort of coalition of the willing or a club of countries, and I think in the moment we're in, I agree with you that it seems unlikely that many of the sort of existing climate institutions are going to be a likely home for multilateral governance. But I don't think we need every country on the planet agreeing to take a step forward. And so, I think the real challenge has been, if you imagine a group of maybe 7 countries, as Pascal was describing, trying to come together to advance this research, they need a concrete research artifact, a research object around which to organize. Countries don't just sort of come together in the abstract and say, we think this is interesting. They say there's a specific thing that we are going to collaborate to advance or to evaluate. There's a decision that we are going to take together. And so what I think is, sort of requisite for this community to do is to define what that roadmap for stage-gated research would look like. And I think it may be a slightly different roadmap for sulfates than it is for an engineered particle, but there's still this question, and I think we can use clinical trials as an analogy, where clinical trials allow you to evaluate a potential intervention and do so in a stage-gated manner. You're doing, a smaller scale test, and then only if certain predefined endpoints are met, you move on to the subsequent phase. And I think something very similar is what's needed here. And when you think about evaluating sulfates, for example, our sense is that a test of less than 10 tons would be what's necessary to evaluate really critical uncertainties around aerosol size distribution. Mingyi earlier was putting up a slide about that. And that would give you the ability to reduce overall uncertainty about safety and efficacy by about half and allow you to validate models. And so I think there's just perhaps if you sort of dismiss sulfate outright, you ignore some of what can be learned if you study sulfate. But there's a lot to be done there, and it would significantly reduce uncertainty and allow us to evaluate that as a true Gen 1.
Yeah, if I may jump in, I think that this is a critical point because we completely agree that it should be this, as you called it, clinical trial approach, where you do things step by steps and you start where the risks are much smaller. On this, we agree. Based on the fact that you have this very high, and again, without getting into this rabbit hole, but based on the fact that you have this huge amount of background in the stratosphere and you're unable to distinguish these 10 tons from these hundreds of thousands of tons that you dispersed there, we believe it, and you cannot also tag these particles because they are reactive and you're essentially dispersing the precursor, you'll end up by not being able to conduct experiments which are not at scale of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of tons. But I would say that we don't need to make a decision here, and it's not for us to make a decision. We're saying we should have options on the table. We believe that an option that is suitable for clinical trial approach, small-scale testing, is definitely one that should be favored. And I would say we should develop all these options and then bring them to, external validators, this sort of FDA and other institutions or the like of FDA that will need to make decisions.
Well, and I think that, when you imagine the club of countries can play a handful of different roles. One can be saying there is a roadmap and we can agree on a roadmap for how we're going to evaluate potential aerosols, potential particles. It could be we are going to collectively fund the research to do that, to reduce uncertainties and to, progress things through those clinical trials. It could be we are going to define the endpoint criteria to say, we understand what a successful completion of a phase 1 trial would look like and the grounds by which we then could move on to a subsequent phase. And I think that's actually really important when you think about, concerns around slippery slope. One of the reasons that I think many people looking at this field get really anxious is this concern that we start doing research and, that just puts us on a sort of perpetual slide to deployment, even if the evidence suggests we shouldn't go there. And so the idea of, having governments involved in defining what those stage gates should look like, I think is a really important step to prevent that type of slide and to allay the concerns of those who are, really worried that that's where things head.
So we don't have a ton of time, but I did want to pull us back big picture for one last question, which is, Dakota, a few minutes ago when I was talking about growing distrust, you pushed back and said, I think that's a bigger phenomenon in the U.S. than around the world. But you also used the phrase coalition of the willing, which I think is what Bush used to invade Iraq, right? And I do wonder about these North-South dynamics in particular. If we're talking about, even research institutions like the University of Chicago, globally respected and trusted, there is a certain amount of distrust that will surround organizations like that in certain parts of the world if they are seen to be doing the work of the most powerful, richest people in the world. And so I wondered what each of you saw as if you're imagining a future in which research goes forward and we do learn that this work is valuable and can be helpful, which, by the way, I do think people often say, like, we're not interested in pushing this, but it does seem like most people who do this work want to see it succeed. But let's imagine a future of a few years down the road, to say 2031, to take Michael's framing from earlier. What does consent look like there at the national level, at the global level, if we're talking about not just doing the research, but also building up regulatory regimes, also developing some amount of global governance, and reckoning with the fact that billions of people around the world are not going to be directly involved in that project? How do we understand consent? Because, repairing some coastal region in Florida is one kind of thing. Maybe even protecting the glaciers is a certain kind of thing. But talking about engineering the entire global average temperature of the planet, I think strikes most people, reasonably or not, as a much bigger undertaking, and they're much more suspicious about that global process. So what does like a good, healthy, from here in 2026 to global consent for this kind of work, what does that process look like to each of you?
I want to start. It's a heavy lift, so I wanted... So first of all, we believe that the scientific work is only one part of it and probably not the most important part, right? Our work is to enable options to convey the information. And I think that the first natural step in terms of the scientific community is to come up, as Dakota was saying, with, I would say, criteria, with protocols, with requirement, what will qualify as a solution that is worthwhile the consideration of policymakers. So this is one task that needs to be done. Another thing that we should be much better than what we've been over the last several years. We have here this distinguished audience and we have the SRM community, but we were not able to break out successfully out of this bubble, engaging religious leaders, engaging thought leaders, engaging people that are concerned in what Michael referred as the real world problems, definitely engaging people in the global south to actually care about this topic. So this is another dimension that we've not been doing enough, and I feel that we should do more. And the last thing I would say is that ideally, as you were asking, in 5 years from now, or I would say in 2 or 3 years from now, I'd like to see 5 or 6 different entities. Some of them could be for-profit companies. Some of them could be spin-offs coming out of universities. Some of them could be non-for-profits that are proposing options for eventually policymakers to consider. Because it's putting this as a take it or leave it. This is the only option on the table. It comes with this long list of challenges. I think that if this will be the situation, we've failed as a scientific community. We're trying to develop our own option, inviting scrutiny and review from the scientific community, obviously working with collaborators. But ideally, I'd like to see several groups doing the same thing and competing under, I would say, a list of criteria that should be established by the scientific community and brought to policymakers.
Dakota?
I think there are many levels to this. I think that at one level, and I see there are people here in the room who've been working on this for many years, but widening who is involved in the science really matters. One of the real challenges is that it is, unless you have access to a supercomputer, it is difficult to do a lot of the work that sort of underpins this research. And so, when we want this to be a globally legitimate decision, we need to change who's actually participating in the science. And we need to make sure that the data is made available to people around the world so that they can interrogate it and, build a base of trust. So that's kind of at a scientist level. I think there's also vital work to be done with civil society. Ultimately, some of these decisions will be made by policymakers in their roles as elected officials. They are responsible to their constituents and they're responsible to civil society organizations within their countries. And we need to have the basis for those individuals and those civil society organizations to engage in this conversation and to share their opinions with their elected officials. And then finally, I think that we do need to think about what the institutions are that can make these type of technical decisions, not as a one-off, but as an ongoing management. I forget who it was earlier who said, some version of this won't be a singular decision. There will be a series of decisions taken. And absent having, an institution or multiple institutions that are equipped with technical staff and with the, know how to weigh really difficult trade-offs, genuinely very, very difficult trade-offs, I don't think we'll have any nucleus for decisions being made well.
So it sort of feels like we're just getting started, but I think we have to thank our panelists and please give them a round of applause.